screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I guess we can start. Oops, like I'm trying to start and there are more people showing up. Oops, one more person. It's crazy. Anyway, so thanks everyone for making it to this event. So today we're going to talk about AI ethics, algorithmic bias, and explainable AI. I'll be your host and moderator for today. You can just call me Stelios. I've spent around 10 years or more of my life working in the space of data science and AI. And I'm the CEO of the Tesseract Academy that is organizing this event. And Tesseract Academy and myself, we specialize in something which I call AI for decision makers. I've spent a good part of my career in the last few years trying to help decision makers of all sorts, from entrepreneurs to managers to CEOs of bigger organizations, better understand how they can use and utilize data science. I've also written up a book on that topic. I'll make sure to share this with anyone who sends me an email. I'll send my email in the chat. And besides the Tesseract Academy, I'm also affiliated with UCL and I'm a data science advisor at London Business School. So the mission of the Tesseract Academy is to help anyone and any company use data science, whether we're talking about hiring or implementing data science, and whether we're talking about startups or entrepreneurs. And here are some of the people that we worked with across the years. And here are some of the bigger companies that we have worked with over the last 3 to 4 years. So AI ethics and algorithmic bias, which is our topic today, is a very big and important topic, which is becoming more and more important. Here you see 3 images, which are part of a webinar, which we have created on that very topic, which exemplify why AI ethics and also algorithmic bias and interpretability in the space of AI are so important. This is a very well-known case study around Amazon that had to ditch a recruitment tool, after they found that it was biased. This is an even more important case study around recidivism, where people spend years in jail because an algorithm that was biased was essentially placing them at a higher risk of committing a crime after they get released from prison than they really were. And here's another case which is actually, I think, which demonstrates in a quite funny way the problem with many computer vision algorithms, since this algorithm here thinks that Michelle Obama is a young man wearing a black shirt. And these are only like 3 case studies which exemplify the problem. And unfortunately, there are many more of these challenges that are going to show up in the next few years. And this is why we're here with some special guests to talk about this problem. We have Dexter, Penn, and Chryssi from Kalgera, Dr. Djamila from Mindsenses, Raluca from Etiq, and Kevin Butler from Centigy. I hope my pronunciation was okay and I didn't slaughter the names of the companies. And today we're going to have a free-flowing conversation around these topics. So we are going to start with some questions. I'll just ask our participants questions in the order of which I see them. And in the meantime, I will kindly ask anyone who's not a panelist, if they have any comments, if they have any questions around what we're discussing, feel free to just type them in the chat. Again, we want this to be a discussion in which other people can participate, and the topic of AI ethics and algorithmic bias is something which doesn't concern only specialists, but I think it concerns society as a whole. So it doesn't matter if you don't know anything about AI, even if you're just curious or have any questions about the topic, me or our panelists, we're more than happy to provide our input. So we've scheduled around 30 minutes for this discussion. I mean, if the discussion is very interesting, we might overrun in time. I guess that's fine. And yeah, that's pretty much it about logistics. And I guess we can get started. Before we get started, I would kindly ask our panelists to share maybe like a 1-minute introduction about themselves. And I'm gonna go in order from like left to right as I see them on my screen. And Kevin, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Stelios.
And welcome everyone. It's good to see you today. I'm Kevin Butler and I am the founder and CEO of Centigy. And I've worked in tech for about 20 years for SAP, IBM, Sage, and a host in the mid-market sector as well. What we do at Centigy is we're helping AI HR tech to become more fairer, and we do that through conformity assessments. Does the AI HR tech conform to the standards, the ethical standards for the US, the UK, or the EU, or all three? And that's the tool that we've built. And this is going to become a lot more prominent now with the EU proposal for regulation of AI systems, of which HR tech is one of them.
Perfect. Thank you, Kevin. And it was actually just 1 minute, so well done. Who'd like to go next? So I think next on my screen is Djamila.
Hi, Studios. Thanks for the invitation and welcome to everyone. My name is Jamila Mimer. I'm the CEO and founder of Mindsenses Global, which is a boutique AI management consultancy with a mission to help businesses apply AI.
Thank you, Djamila. And then Raluca.
Hi, thanks a lot for the invite. Looking forward to this. I'm a co-founder and CTO of Etiq, which is a startup focusing on tackling the algorithmic bias problem, but with a focus on the financial sector. I'm a data scientist by kind of trade. I've been in the general space for about 10 years now. And yeah, really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's obviously what we do at Etiq and what we try to kind of help people solve for. So it's, yeah, right down my alley, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think everyone's looking forward to our conversation today. I mean, it's a very hot topic. And Chryssi, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Stelios, for having us here. Yes, I've nearly 20 years of experience in the financial industry sector, so I cover a breadth of areas from regulation to banking to fintech, and I'm now working as a CEO at Kalgera. And we're developing models, and Dexter can expand on this, AI models to identify financial vulnerable customers. And it has come within our company plenty of times to develop an internal framework to make sure that what we are developing abides to ethical standards.
Excellent. And last but not least, Dexter.
Hi there. Hi. Thank you very much for having us, Stelios. I'm really glad to join this conversation. So I'm Dexter Penn. I'm the founder and CEO of Kalgera, and my background is coming from more than 10 years working in medicine as a doctor and looking after people living with dementia. And Kalgera started as a means to protect people that are at risk of financial abuse. And I'm just really interested to share a bit about our experience with everyone in what we've learnt to date and tackling the bias that is often implicit within some of the models that currently exist and how we can help change some of that.
Excellent. Great. So we'll start with our first question. And the first question is, could you share with us one or a few case studies from your experience of algorithmic bias? Or if you can't share any case studies of this kind, maybe a case study where AI ethics or ethics about an algorithm became an important concern. So Kevin, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, and anyone else jump in. It's a panel discussion, but I think maybe one that stands to mind. There's been many cases reported of Uber in the news recently. Algorithmic bias against some faces that it just can't recognize, and they come from different minorities. There's a case of an individual who was trans, who also lost their license and was suspended. Well, not the license, but they were suspended from driving. But there are dozens and dozens of Uber drivers that the facial recognition didn't recognize. They had no recourse. There was no way around it, and they were out of work for a couple of weeks. So I think it's a good case because it shows the damage that poor tech can have. And I'm sure that the developers of this technology certainly didn't set it out to create something that was racist. And I doubt Uber certainly wanted that to happen either. But because they didn't have a remedy, a lot of people's lives were affected. And also Uber are in enough hot water as it is without having more negative press. So I really do think that a lot of organizations, executives, they're making decisions to select HR tech, or HR tech, just any AI tech really, to be aware of where the pitfalls lie and to have a remedy. Can you contact a human being to validate? Can you just send your passport in, or whatever it happens to be? Because these things will just keep happening.
That's a very interesting case study, and I think it's very, very similar to the one I mentioned earlier, which we're also covering in the webinar. I shared the link on the chat around Amazon, which is, to my knowledge, I think this was the first big PR scandal related to algorithmic bias.
Yes, and that's about 6 years ago now that Amazon incident occurred. And they just trained it on historical data, and it didn't work. So they pulled the plug on it. They never really used it. It was just tested internally. But it's a good example of using like poor data with no science and trying to get a good outcome. And it was always going to be bias in the system.
Yeah, which is the case quite often. Thank you. So that was very interesting. So who would like to go next? Jamila, your next one on my screen, left to right.
Yeah, actually, there are like a lot of examples of AI bias. We can choose and pick which one to talk about. But one of the earlier ones that happens like a lot early in the development of AI is the famous Microsoft Twitter chatbot. Which basically after 24 hours of release, it became very, very racist and aggressive to the point where they have basically to stop it and basically take it out. So this is another example where you have bias, not from the data that was trained on, but it was once it started interacting with users, it has picked up that aggressive language.
I think that's very interesting because it raises the question, is humanity, or at least a part of humanity that spends too much time on the internet, evil? And it's a very difficult thing to answer, because I think many of the people who did this were actually like trolls, right? Who just thought that's very, very funny.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very crucial point. There are like different factors that affect AI bias or algorithmic bias. And maybe before we go further into the discussion, let me share kind of my definition of algorithmic bias. So for me, it is a systematic and repeatable computer error that result in unfair outcomes that, for example, can privilege one group over another.
That's very interesting. So I'll take a note on that, because maybe we can revisit this later, because you're talking about a systematic error, which means it's part of the algorithm, but I think it can also be part of the data, as the Amazon case exemplifies.
Yeah. And also the facial recognition example that Kevin mentioned. So a lot of it, there are a lot of sources. So one of them is data or lack of data availability. So for example, when you look at facial recognition softwares, most of the data that has been used to train those models, basically 80% of the data are men, and then 70% of them are white men. So that gives you an indication of the representation of women and ethnic minority data that went into the facial recognition training.
No, I think that's very good input. Raluca, what do you think about this?
Yes, I completely agree. I think, definitely there's an issue with NLP and facial recognition, but I think also like Kevin was mentioning some of the examples in, I guess, more predictive modeling kind of systems. So what we're looking at a lot is the financial sector. And for instance, as you know, I'm a big believer in using as much data as possible, without infringement of privacy and stuff like that. But ideally, more data should kind of, in theory, at least make for more accurate outcomes. But some of the data sources, like, open banking data is great. It's like super complete. Bank statements are really great. They really enrich, some use cases like thin file and so forth. But sometimes it's very hard to unpick some proxies from them. So for instance, alimony payments not being labeled as income. And I know obviously I'm making a assumption about, the distribution of alimony payments, but that's, there should be some way to check for this in that kind of data. Or we see some use cases where, like we don't see this use case as, let's say, some potential situations where if you have a certain model that uses kind of real-time predictions, like buy now, save later kind of models, because it's based on kind of your immediate browsing behavior, obviously that tends to be highly correlated with some of the demographics, especially gender-based, stay-at-home demographics. And it can really, I guess, by all means, I'm, like I said, big believer, use more data, great, but just check kind of a little bit what you're using, especially when the data balloons, then odds are there's going to be a pretty good proxy there, and just make sure that you can kind of handle that well.
I think that's a great point, and it's also an interesting technical note, because I guess we'll get into this topic in our next question. But my personal opinion is that the whole area, on one hand, is it faces some technical challenges which are being addressed by the research community. On the other hand, there are clearly many social and cultural challenges which maybe algorithms will not find it easy to address. Chryssi, do you have anything to add on what was discussed?
Yeah, sure. And as everyone was speaking, I was thinking of a few examples. So the other day I was speaking with the KYC AML provider that do facial recognition to identify whether the person who is accessing a financial application is the person whom they identify at the passport or an ID verification documentation. And they did give an example that a few of the other providers could not pick up the identification. The ID, I couldn't verify correctly the ID documentation. And when they had their selfie or they made like a liveliness test on the camera, it couldn't match with the ID, with the passport. And it just makes you realize that still we have a lot of work to be done. If we think that, for example, now more and more companies are using automated processes like Jumio, Onfido, Credas. There are many of these type of applications to verify, or like banks verify their customers. And where, again, I think Djamila was mentioning, again, there are not enough data resources, so they may have trained their applications on certain images, recognize certain features, and then they're just unable or fail to recognize other features. And even so when more of these main applications have been trained on more developed countries, we have a long way to go for developing countries. And it just, you just realize that there is a different level playing field across the globe on financial services and fintech applications.
No, that's a very good point, and I think a theme that is emerging from your answers is that you're all talking about different industries, different examples like HR, finance, chatbots, which I guess demonstrates the size of this problem, and let's say in a sense that you would be ubiquitous. Like maybe someone has been exposed to a case study and they're like, oh no, it's, you know, this problem exists in the legal system, or no, maybe it only exists in the you know, in computer vision. But then you soon realize that as AI and data science gets adopted by more and more companies, by governments, by societies as a whole, then there will be many more cases of these problems, unfortunately, which weren't predicted. I think it's very similar to data privacy, right? So people thought that, you know, maybe data privacy is only something that's around Facebook and the, you know, how Facebook is using data. But the more someone digs into it, I think now the average person understands that data privacy extends far beyond social media, which is what many people thought 5 years ago. Dexter, what do you think? I see you nodding.
So everything and all of the examples that have been shared, they're all really interesting. I think if we sort of look critically at this, one of the common things really is that you can't necessarily take one approach from one industry and one type of data and apply it in another and expect for it to be effective. And there's a lot of questions really that I have, and I'm, you know, coming from although, you know, I'm working in fintech, I'm coming from a medical background and working with health data. There are lots of biases that actually are living within the data, and I think it's very naive to think that if you necessarily get more data that it's going to fix the problems, because actually the problems that exist are not problems that data scientists can fix per se. These are societal problems with you know, different prejudices on, you know, different characteristics of people. So I think it's really important for anyone that's using any kind of data science, and I know that this is new in terms of, you know, thinking about these things outside of the computations, but actually thinking, okay, what data am I really collecting? What is this actually reflecting in terms of the data subjects that are being analyzed, and, you know, what's the legal basis for having these data? And when you're doing these analyses, it's really important to think about unintended consequences of how this could be used, because that old saying is, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. And I think this is very important, because we sometimes do, you know, you are at a point where you are trying to get this sort of breakthrough in the calculations, or predicting something that might be of interest within the group that you're working. But we really have to stop and think about the issues surrounding trust, and what is the actual outcome, and how is this going to be used, and if this is going to be used for things that can actually change people's lives positively or negatively. We need to really consider those outcomes and the impact that could have, and take it from there, just being much more sort of thoughtful in the way we're implementing things. But yeah, that would be what I would add.
I think this comment around health data reminds me of a case study, which I also talk about on the webinar. I'm sharing the link again for anyone who missed this, where there was this algorithm in the States that was biased against Black people. Basically, it was based on data of people who are visiting hospitals, and because the people in the US who visit hospitals are usually more well off because they have more money to spend. this algorithm ended up thinking that the people of a certain color, they're at less need of medical services. And when they fixed this bias, then the actual admissions multiplied by a factor of like 3, 4, 5, something crazy basically, because it means people died because of that. It's just like when your brain explodes.
I mean, it has all sorts of implications, even something as simple as offering pain medication to people that come in pain because of, you know, different biases that already existed. The data is already biased. So you need to just, you know, if you don't think about it, then you won't be able to correct for it.
Yeah, and I guess it's also the fact that there are different parts involved in this problem, different entities. So for example, if let's say a health service hires a group of data scientists to develop an algorithm, it's quite likely that these data scientists have no idea of, you know, that this particular problem might exist, right? So it's not the first thing that comes to mind unless you have hands-on experience with this domain. And maybe no such people exist. Maybe there are no data scientists, you know, in a particular point in time who have experience around this domain and recognize the problem, which obviously perpetuates this issue. And I think this gets us to our next question, which is, I think it's going to really hit up the discussion. What can we do to address bias, right? This is an unsolved problem, right? So I know people have different opinions. I know that some of our panelists are also working on solutions around certain areas of bias or interpretability or AI ethics. So I think it's going to be very interesting to hear what everyone thinks. Kevin, what is your opinion? How can we address bias?
So when you ask the question, how can we address bias? So we have to look at ourselves. How are we addressing our bias? Because if we're looking at it from an AI perspective, all we're doing is just mirroring our bias in these systems. They're inheriting our bias. So it starts with the developers, and you have enough representation on that development team, of course. You also have, like, there's many different actors involved in removing as much bias as possible from an AI system, because a system involves humans and process as well. So really, it's a very complex task. I can see the solution to this, the EU regulation that's being proposed, is really trying to tackle it, and it's a huge step forward for the fundamental rights of people. It's absolutely massive. Right now, you can create an algorithm just based off an idea with no science, and you can use dirty data all you like, and as long as it sells and you hire people and you make money, that's fine. But in the future, that's not going to be fine, because if that algorithm that you've created affects people's fundamental rights, it will be outlawed, or it will be deemed as high risk, and therefore you'll have to conform to the ethical standards for that state and for the union of the EU. And this is not just for the EU. I know we're in the UK here, a lot of us are. This standard that the EU are setting it's a global standard, much like GDPR. So this is really going to take off, and I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm fully behind it.
Okay, that's very interesting. So essentially, you're saying that the regulation can go a long way to fix this problem. I think, in my opinion, it's a similar situation to data privacy, right? Like, people didn't think it was a problem, and then Cambridge Analytica took place, and then many things have changed since then, including GDPR, right?
So that's a good point, at Cambridge Analytica. So that is now prohibited. Right? That is going to be completely prohibited. They've gone through various different risk profiles of tech, and Cambridge Analytica is absolutely prohibited, as is remote biometric scanning of individuals in a public space. So yeah, both of those are now out, which is again huge for fundamental rights.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Jamila, what do you think? What can we do to address bias?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that we can do. One of them, obviously Kevin mentioned the importance of team diversity. I think another one for me will be just raising awareness in education. There are a lot of, people, data scientists, developer, who are not aware enough of kind of like the dimension of the consequence of, not thinking about the ethical use of AI, how to to deal with the data. So I think kind of like bringing education as a first step to hopefully solve this. I think obviously the biases do not come necessarily from AI. They're coming from the people using developing the tools. They're coming from the data. They're coming from the way the data is analyzed and so on. But I think there is one inherent characteristic of AI that just make things a little bit difficult. So we all know that AI basically it's predicting the future based on the past. So whenever you are working on a sector, on a topic where you know that your present time is not a reflection of your past, that then you know that you are going to get into troubles, because you are going to try to predict something that has absolutely no relation, no reflection of your present time. So it's the issue of the link between future and past that you will have to also think really well enough before you start your journey and your AI applications.
I think that's a very interesting point, and I know, Raluca, that you're also pretty hands-on. What do you think? Feel free to get a bit more technical. I guess technical,
Sure.
but not everyone here is a data scientist. But yeah, what do you think?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, fully agree with Kevin, Jamila, and also what Dexter said earlier, that, this is a very complex problem with where the solution can come from all different places. We're primarily focused on kind of the data science, this process, let's say. So from kind of data preparation, training, testing and so forth. So that's our focus, but obviously the causes for bias are kind of all around. So whenever you introduce a human element or, at any point really, when you put in production and so forth. But what we find is that at this level, even a kind of, tool or platform that really supports the data scientists, but not really having to make them undergo like intense paper reading for like a few weeks, before they can implement something, but just start to get them to think about what are some measures, what are some things that they need to look for in the data and in the kind of data model interaction they're dealing with, so that at the end of the day, their outcome is not as potentially flawed. So in practice, what we're doing is we're kind of giving them building blocks to build this. Debiasing is the wrong terms, but these pipelines that help them identify and mitigate this pipeline that help them identify some of the issues in like their data or in their kind of trained data. And then we give them some options to be like, okay, well, if you, maybe sample a little bit differently, try that, try sampling a little bit differently, maybe things will change on kind of some of the metrics you're looking at. Maybe actually you have a population for which you generally don't have any data. So like you're modeling for these people, you're going to give some decisions to them and you have no idea what you're doing because they look very different from everyone else that's in your sample. So either get some data for them or, to do something about it. So I think that's kind of our angle a little bit. It's more on the data scientist, what he or she does or they do, and trying to get them to identify these issues and then give them some options to repair them, basically. It's a very tough topic, right? But there's a lot of research out there and, no one seems to be using it. Very few people are using it. So it'd be nice to see a little bit more kind of interest from the practitioners and actual application of it.
I think there's an interesting theme emerging. So Kevin talked more about regulation. So on one hand, that's partly a legal problem. Then Jamila talked about the data science process, the process through which the problem is actually solved. Whereas you're talking also about the data or some other more technical solutions. And I think this demonstrates that that's a multi-dimensional problem. So it's not like there's one solution, like a master algorithm or some process that someone's going to come up with and solve the problem of bias, in every domain, which I think is what partly what makes it so challenging, right? So, Chryssi, what do you think? What's your opinion? How do you think we can address bias?
Yeah, so I liked what Dexter mentioned earlier about mindfulness, and also Jamila mentioned consequences. And I think this is what part of the regulations and the frameworks that are put in place. Up to currently, AI models would be considered as black boxes because nobody really can interpret what's going on within the algorithms. And the more aware the data scientists are in terms of understanding the problem and the consequences of what they're developing, but also the organization that and the governance who is like managing the process of this development of these models are put like techniques in place to understand the risks and understand also the advantages and weigh them out, because it's very important to be well, it's not easy to control everything, especially at this beginning, at this like boom or the beginning of AI models being implemented in more and more companies and in more areas. But the more awareness is developed within the organization and putting these like risk mitigation techniques, it gives like a frame or something to make the people involved in the process to say, aha, wait, I have to be mindful of this. Maybe let me follow the process. Have I thought of that? Yes, it's important to make people aware that whatever one develops, I mean, any technology can be used in a positive way and in a negative way. One has to consider also the consequences of its use. So what one processes and what the outcome of these models have to be also somehow framed in a way that it does not harm society.
But is this something that data scientists should be not only aware but responsible of, or is this something better suited maybe for a different stakeholder within an organization, or maybe an entirely different role in the future?
This is quite complex. One can think perhaps of some examples in the past and think of how new technologies emerge and apply a relative similar or adapted governance model. But if you think of like, I come from the financial industry, so if you think about companies had started to develop models to predict or understand the risk of their assets or their portfolios. Yeah. And then more and more risk management techniques were put in place, frameworks, and therefore also regulations to manage the output. I mean, you can say that you are able to predict the risk of an asset or an industry or a sector, and what does that mean? What's considered? Where's the limit of risky and non-risky, and what do you do to manage what's risky? And yes, you need more functions or more people to be able to manage and understand this process better. I think that comes also with more research, understanding use cases better, and including them in the process of an organization.
No, that's a very good point. It clearly demonstrates that it's not straightforward, right? Definitely isn't. Dexter, what do you think? I see you nodding your head once again, so you must agree with what I just said.
So I think just echoing the points raised prior. As an academic, I went to examine the literature on AI ethics in financial services, and when we look at the timeline, there were only 15 papers published in 2012 about this topic, and last year this was almost 170. And there's a huge sort of explosion in awareness. And I think, yes, Cambridge Analytica does have something to do with this, in that there's been a concerted effort now to try to understand how the misuse of data, not purely on the privacy point, but we saw the impact in terms of political manipulation, and that's a real threat to the democracies that we live in. And I think that actually we have to go back to Jamila's definition about what bias in data actually means in terms of privileging one group against another. And I really liked the way how Raluca put the integration of like in each step of your process when you're handling data to consider where there could be some bias that may influence the results, and really thinking very carefully about sampling and actually maybe stopping and seeing, well, can I actually get some more relevant data to make sure that I'm having a sample that is actually representative? Because what we've been working on at Kalgera, it's been a framework looking at exactly how individuals are at risk of being financially abused, and what are the underlying drivers that would be influencing in that risk. And when we're sort of looking at these groups, we realized that, well, yeah, there's a lot of marginalized groups, but before we went into this, we really understood at the core what were the driving factors. And there's been lots of really good work that's been done by the Alan Turing Institute, and also the Information Commissioner's Office, in terms of signposting you to the best practice. But at the end of the day, I think the only way that we'll be able to remove bias is that we've got to audit. And you must actually look at how your models are performing in the real world, and looking at any of the unintended consequences that you've thought about when you were initially developing it. Have any of those actually happened, and what's been the impact there? Because I think that we are able to at least recognize some of these well, poor outcomes, I would say, of the implementation of a model. But I think we do need to continuously monitor and evaluate what's actually happening, because we'll be able to see some of these problems when they're small problems as opposed to big ones. Because we are, in our area, we're looking at improving financial inclusion, and the World Bank definition of financial inclusion, it's being able to put processes in place, and in our case, we're using some technology in order to help people actually reach their goal, which in our case is that they would like to continue living independently, no matter what type of underlying vulnerability that person may have at that point in time. And we really have to just take a step back and ask, why are we actually using any of these models? And based on that, we have to just keep revisiting and re-auditing the underlying reason, because as I said earlier, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should, and you just need to make sure that you do what is in your sort of charter for your product or your service, and that ultimate goal that you're trying to reach, or that problem that you're trying to solve, that you're meeting that, so that you stay on track. Because usually when you just start doing things just because it looks interesting, that's when you end up in trouble. But yeah, that's where I would leave things.
I think something interesting around the AI ethics framework is that, whereas Kevin talked more about the regulation, the whole idea, I guess, behind the AI ethics framework is that companies need to take more accountability of what they're doing. So, which is, I guess, one other approach. I don't know whether there's going to be a legal, requirement in the future to actually demonstrate that you followed this kind of framework of this kind, but who knows? It's quite likely. And we have like a couple of very interesting questions. So Dennis, he asked a new question now, but he also asked another question earlier on, which I promised I'm going to ask our panelists. And given that we're already around 40, 50 minutes into this event, I will break the order, and if anyone wants to answer this question, feel free to just go ahead. The question that Dennis is asking is the bias inherent in the AI itself, or is it more inherently built into the bias of the teams that design the application of the AI systems? So basically, is it more societal or peer group, or the system?
It's both, and it can creep in at any stage. It could be the data that you used, various different stages of modeling and training. It could be the individuals on the development team. It could be the users of it. The tool could have capability for good and bad bias, but it depends on the user. Much like a scalpel in the wrong hands will do damage, yeah, but in a surgeon's hands could save lives. So bias can creep in at any stage.
That's a good point. Who else would like to contribute? I'm sure that's a question that everyone has something to to say about. Jamila, do you think it's more of an internal problem into the system?
In mindfulness and understanding.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Hello? Yes, I think it's like a sum up of what we have discussed so far. So it comes with one has to be mindful of the process. So within an organization, it can be from the data sources to the data scientists, to the people who are supporting the data scientists to build the frameworks. And then it's also how it is managed. It could be also the regulators, how well they actually regulate or understand the risks of this technology and how much they impose on companies to audit themselves. Also how the users can use the application, because every technology can be used in a positive and negative way. So I think it's a multidimensional, and by being aware of this, one can do the best to control or manage it or monitor it.
No, that's a very good point. And Dennis also asked one more question, and then Injan also asked another question. I think we have enough time to address both. I'll try to condense what Dennis is asking, and basically the question is, I think, I'll try to break it down and find the piece which I think is probably the most relevant to our discussion, which is whether the regulators, if they do not understand the capability assumptions of data science and its applications, can they design the right code of ethics in a realistic legal framework? And I guess regulators here can mean from the EU down to individual governments, down to the ICO. So anyone would like to share their thoughts?
I can jump in here. Just at this point, I think the one thing that we haven't mentioned is public engagement and trust of the individuals. We all are living in a society that is governed by a set of rules that we all subscribe to, because there are some benefits that we get for playing by those rules. And I think because people don't understand and there's a lot of mistrust, then there inherently is some difficulty there for you to put in a regulation for the benefit of a public that doesn't understand why it's being protected. And I think we just need to be careful that we aren't doing regulation for regulation's sake, because we do want to make sure that we aren't stifling innovation. And I think the way that the regulators really can do this is by engaging across the different stakeholder groups. And we need to make sure that diversity of thought, not just in terms of background, but I've been to some of these things. I've been to number 10. I've been on the all-party parliamentary group for longevity, and you end up in a bit where, well, everyone is kind of, even though you might have some women and you might have some people of color in the room, we're all a bit more on the elite end of the spectrum. And I think we really need to take a step back and see in terms of helping people to understand, exactly how this is going to impact their lives, so that the person with the lowest common denominator really would be able to benefit from this. And then you could take that stance when designing the regulation, so that it actually can still work well. Because I do get a little bit uncomfortable when we talk about immediately going to do some regulation when we haven't actually done the research as yet to understand what some of the core problems are. We have some good use cases that we spoke about earlier, but I think a lot more needs to be understood on that path. And in the meantime, we may have to actually rely on companies doing their own sort of self-auditing, but the regulator may need to ask to see those audits from time to time until there's a full regulation in place, because these things don't happen overnight. These regulations normally take at least a decade, sometimes more, and there may need to be some change in the legislation as well, which again could take quite some time. So we do need to think how we can do this most efficiently so that we don't lag behind, but at the same time we don't leave people behind from the benefits of it.
So I think that's a very good point, especially the part that regulators can take a long time. And I think we have time for one last question. Ingen was asking about some ethical issues in AI. I think we probably covered some of these. So maybe we can go straight to the second question and the last one for this panel. What is the role of governance in AI? A bit open-ended, but maybe someone would like to jump in.
Yeah, I'll say something about governance. It's, I think it's really critical to get the governance. And for me, when I say governance, I also, think of accountability, that aspect. So having like a clear governance process that say, for every single piece of that AI application, we know exactly who is accountable, what the process, to follow is very important, and who needs to sign on the decision. And a very kind of like famous example is, for example, when you are dealing with a driverless car. So kind of like if something goes wrong, if there is an incident and someone dies, who is really accountable, for that incident? Is it the factory who built the driverless car? Is it the AI software who developed, the software? Or is it the company who trained the kind of the driving capabilities? And I think all that will be answered if you have like a clear kind of accountability governance process, and kind of assign on in every single milestone step of that.
No, that's a very good point. I think Luca, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely AI regulation, there should be something like that, but I think there's 2 points. One, kind of echoing Jamila's from earlier, it should be clear to companies that, and to the data scientists really, that build these things, that if their outcome is biased, then likely it's also wrong. I think there's not like really a correlation being done there in their minds, which is odd, because you want to have the best model that really reflects reality. So why don't you look at these things as well? And I think the second bit I wanted to say was, I think that Dexter made a very good point, but I think data science, it does matter. Like all the different groups should be represented. And I think what we're lacking a little bit now is a way for people outside, like kind of data scientist, developer, maybe community, maybe some business stakeholders, but people outside this kind of rarefied group to really engage with these things in a way in which it's clear to them what they're doing, so they can bring their own hypotheses into them, because this group is relatively rarefied, right? So they have their own kind of limited baggage of experience. So it'd be nice to be able to create a system that has like more of that human machine interaction at the core, like that really kind of just brings it up a little bit more. I think it's like a very tricky design challenge as well, but yeah.
Yeah, it is a multifaceted challenge, right? It's a design challenge, it's a technical challenge, it's a cultural challenge. And I think we could talk and keep talking about this topic for hours. But I guess this event has come to an end. So I'd like to thank our panelists and any last words before we conclude.
Yes, I can add a few last words. Jamila mentioned in the beginning education, and we talked about the legal frameworks or regulation or self-audit and the data risks, but it is about more and more education. I think if more parts of society understand what AI models do or how they interact or what means of giving data, what type of data is processed, as well as for the data scientists understanding more societal problems and how their models can impact society. It would help with this interaction, and it takes time. It takes time for these type of concepts to move into mainstream and get more embedded in educational curriculums for a wider audience.
That's a great point. Anyone else who would like to share a few words before we conclude?
I'd just like to thank you for having us. It was a really great conversation, and I'm very much interested to see where things go at this point. And I think we do, need to just continue having these conversations and carefully just think about how we are actually moving forward, because from my point of view, we want to use technology to make the world a little bit better. And we just need to be mindful of some of the minefields that exist, and just being very focused about what we'd like to achieve, because we won't be able to solve all problems, but we will be able to solve many of them. So I just want to let everyone take that away and just see that there is a lot of positive impact that we can, but we just need to look at the risks first.
Absolutely.
And I think going back to what you said earlier, Dexter, about the educational piece, making sure that the man on the street understands what we're talking about here. It's it's important that we all tell our friends, we appear on podcasts, we get this message out as much as possible about the risks and rewards of good and bad technology. And I think it's everybody that's joined here today should be vocal in that respect.
Yeah, Stelios, thanks for the invite. I think, just like to say just a few words. I think, this is a very important topic, and we should all continue this, the discussion even outside this forum, and, think about, the things that we can do and action to minimize, those risks.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just to echo that, I'd say that, yeah, if I'm always personally happy to have any conversations on this topic, and any way I guess either myself or my company can help either illuminate some of these issues for data scientists, or just help in any way, happy to do it, because education, I think we're still not 100% there. So I think we still need to kind of work on this a little bit more. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So hopefully this event helped provide some clarity to what is constantly evolving space, and I hope our participants found this useful and interesting. So a round of applause for our panelists. Here's a clap emoji from me. So thanks everyone for participating in this. Make sure to register to our newsletter to receive a notification about the recording, which will go live on YouTube. And also make sure to check out the webinar and the Decision Makers Handbook to Data Science. I've left links in the, I've left links in the chat. We need a part 2. Yes, absolutely. Maybe the next few months we can organize a part 2. Why not? And I'm sure that, you know, next discussion, this space is evolving so rapidly that, you know, if we organize another discussion in 6 months, I'm sure we'll have plenty of things to say. So thanks everyone, and we hope to see you again soon in some other of our events. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.